Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. We got two of our favorite panelists, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp and Rachel Bovard. We've got Glenn Greenwald on to update us on the situation in Israel. Brian Grimm has a new report looking at the corporations lobbying hard against the Pro-Union Pro-Act. But we wanted to start with the very latest in infrastructure negotiations.
Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff going on here. Let's put this up there on the screen from Politico. GOP weighs going bigger on infrastructure. So basically there is an internal debate within the GOP caucus. Senator Mitch McConnell already came out. He's like, well, we're only going to do $600 billion and we're not going to raise the corporate tax rate. Or taxes, period. So you're like, okay, well, what has happened is that the Biden White House is very committed to, quote unquote, paying for it. So they are saying that there is no way that they're going to do this plan without some sort of tax increase. So you're at an immovable place where GOP says that they won't do deficit spending and they won't raise taxes. Therefore, they're not actually for it. Like, there's no actual way in order to do it. And if they were for it, they'd probably be for like a gas tax, which again, there's nothing I hate more than gas tax.
Yeah, I mean, that's the silliness of all of this, is the Biden administration, for some reason, they seem to have the right mentality around like the checks and the Relief Act of, look, our definition of bipartisan support is if some Republicans in the country support it, even if these idiots aren't going to get on board, that's going to be our definition of bipartisanship. They didn't waste a lot of time in the theater of pretending like maybe they're going to come to a deal. This time around, they either genuinely think it'd be better and something to run on in the midterms if they got a bipartisan deal with Republicans, or they think the politics of at least going through the motions of pretending to negotiate with these people are worthwhile. I think that's a silly position because, as you just laid out, Politico in this whole article, they frame it around like, oh, some Republicans say maybe they'll up the price and maybe they'll go up to $800 billion, as if this is, actually a possibility of negotiation. And then halfway through the article, they talk to Senator Roger Wicker, who says there will not be one Republican vote for the package when it includes higher corporate taxes. Republicans want to pay for it with user fees. That means the working
called a gas
class
tax.
You're right. That means a gas tax or other, ways of charging the working class for infrastructure that, of course, people like Jeff Bezos and Amazon benefit from more than absolutely anyone else. So this is all theater. It's a non-starter. Not one Republican is going to vote for anything the Democrats propose. The Democrats are certainly not going to go along with this idea of like, let's fund it with user fees. By the way, I also think the obsession with like, we have to pay for it is silly, as we've talked about here as well. But one dynamic that is interesting is that there's a real generational split within the Republican Party on their approach to taxes and spending. So it shows that younger Republicans are actually very much in favor of spending more money on programs to create new jobs. You can see all the way over there on the far right of the screen, you have 74% of Republicans over 45 saying that they want to keep spending and taxes low. Those numbers are almost exactly flipped for Republicans under 45. 71% of say they prefer to spend money on programs to create jobs and improve the economy. So there's a huge generational divide here within the GOP that I haven't seen laid out in such stark terms before.
Well, it makes sense. People who are under 45 and who are Republicans are largely doing this for cultural reasons, whereas people who are over 45, mostly the boomers, are the ones who remember the Reagan era.
Yeah, it's Reagan, Cold War, all that crap.
Came up with a lot of that ideology, which is largely baked into them, which is why there is like an organic constituency against raising taxes, but it is not the majority of the people in America who vote Republican, and it's especially not the majority of people who vote for Trump. And I think that is a thing where, again, they just don't know how to wrap their heads around how much the electorate has actually dramatically shifted in just the last 10 years. This is one of those things where Trump ran on. He could have proposed a $2 billion infrastructure package entirely deficit financed in 2017, and they all probably would have voted for it.
Absolutely.
Or they would have tried not to, but the base would have been totally behind Trump. It would have been like the America First rebuilding plan or whatever, and a bunch of Democrats would have had to jump on board too. That's like the retcon of the functional Trump presidency.
And he probably would have gotten reelected too, by the way.
Easily would have gotten reelected. I mean, can you imagine if the Trump highway system or whatever, you could put his name on it? Like, it
that's what
they
I
would have
thought.
loved it. Yeah.
I thought there'd be like a project in every district. I thought Democrats are totally screwed. This guy's going to open up the spending. Trump project visibly in every district, but they never got around to it.
They're far too dumb.
A joke.
They're far too dumb to do any of that. And at the same time, you flagged this. Bernie Sanders coming out and talking about the negotiations, put it up there, skeptical of the Biden White House's deal-making plan, saying, in general, I don't agree with it. The American people want results. I think it is interesting.
I like that second quote, too, there. He says, frankly, when people got a $1,400 check or $5,600 check for their family, they didn't say, oh, I can't cash this check because it was done without any Republican votes. He understands that people don't care how many stupid Republicans voted for or stupid Democrats voted for it. They just care if it's going to ultimately deliver for
That's what Republicans knew, too, whenever they passed it. They're like, look, we know X% of Democrats support this, so, like, why don't you line up with your constituents? It's a fake talking point that both sides deploy. And the real thing is that, I mean, there's an element of truth to it, but the reason why all of these people are lining up for is for purely partisan reasons. If you vote for the Biden plan, your opponent will be like, you voted with Joe Biden. It's very difficult to break out of that dynamic. It is funny, though, because it's not like the dynamic is just or is just Democrat and GOP. There's all this intra-Democratic fighting around the SALT tax and all of that. Bernie was actually asked about it by Axios. Let's take a listen to what he said.
It sends a terrible, terrible message. So ultimately, what you have got to do, and fairness to Schumer and Pelosi, it is hard when you have tiny margins. But you have got to make it clear which side you are on. And you can't be on the side of the wealthy and the powerful if you're going to really fight for working families.
There we go. It's a tough one because they are basically holding up the a lot of the House Democrats in particular, because they have the margins in order to hold the votes just for SALT. And it's amazing to watch. Also, I recently found out Elise Stefanik voted against the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And I was like, oh, so she actually did something decent for once. And the reason she didn't vote for the TCJA is because of SALT. And I was like, you cannot make this stuff up, folks.
That's perfect.
It's amazing. It just goes to show who has the real power in Congress. Who are they willing to blow up an entire deal? Josh Gottheimer.
Yeah.
No SALT, no dice.
Well,
and again, this is a tax cut for millionaires. Only, almost exclusively, 90% of the benefit goes to people who make over $1 million or more. And it goes to people who are like, well, I'm rich, but I don't feel rich because I live in a really expensive house. I'm like, well, I don't feel that bad.
Yeah, you don't have like a right to live in the most expensive neighborhood in New York, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, Bernie obviously is completely correct there, and he's pointing out the farce of the fact that these people are willing to go to the mat to fight for a tax cut for the wealthy. Democrats willing to go to the mat to fight for a tax cut for the wealthy, and meanwhile, they're not even trying with the minimum wage. Now, I will say that Bernie Sanders actually has more power than Josh Gottheimer has as the chair of the Senate Budget Committee and one of the most influential political voices in the entire country. So if he was willing to draw a red line.
You could say no SALT, no dice.
No SALT, no dice. Or, we'll give you your SALT tax. We want our $15 minimum wage hike or something else that will actually deliver for the working class. He himself, with a couple of friends, actually him alone, could potentially make that happen. So there has to be a recognition here, too, of why it is that right-wing Democrats get their way so often. It's because they're willing to play hardball for the worst possible outcomes. And that's what you see here. One thing that occurred to me with the Biden administration's posture on all of this, they've been very good. Kind of their signature political move from the beginning of the Democratic primary is ignoring the Twitter conversation. He's historically offline for a modern day president. They don't get caught up in whatever the silly outrage of the day thing is. But I think they are too influenced by the sort of beltway mainstream media narrative. And so there's been this little bit of a drumbeat coming from the Beltway press of they're supposed to work in a bipartisan manner. And what about bipartisan deal making? And what about the civility that we're supposed to be bringing back? So I see a little bit of an influence of that conversation, which is the one they really should be ignoring in the way that they're approaching these infrastructure negotiations. And part of why this is so significant this week is that Congress is back in session.
I think 8 more days.
They're all supposed to be meeting tomorrow on Wednesday to see if they're going to ultimately work out some kind of a deal. Clock is ticking. And actually, New York Times pointed out yesterday, Democrats are old. And you're counting on, like, you're betting against the actuarial tables every day that you let this thing go and just bank on having your full majority for the next 2 years. None of that's guaranteed.
No, it's not guaranteed whatsoever. And it does go to show, once again, Biden billed himself as FDR. It's well past 100 days here in terms of time in the White House. You've passed one major piece of legislation. I think it was a good piece of legislation. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's not necessarily enough to save you. It's certainly not the transformative effect that you intimated that it was going to be. And so from that perspective, I mean, it's going to be if this one runs up against a partisan gridlock, which all indications say it will, right, that it will run up against filibuster and all of that, we could be looking at months more. Okay, they haven't even started reconciliation. That takes 6 weeks. So it's like, well, what? Congress out of session, so the next time they come back, they're going to trigger reconciliation. We're looking 2 to 6 months if negotiations continue, and that's just a long time in partisan politics.
We will see how it goes. We're going to tell you what's on our radars. That's next.